we offer two possible refinements. Basically, it's personal protective equipment and or reduced use rate. This is what it looks like when you open up the tool. It's data entry and reporting is on one screen. I just made up one example here. As soon as you enter a vapor pressure and a molecular weight, you'll be offered an exposure assessment right away. There's no more to enter than that. Even if you don't fill in the denotes, you will still get an exposure assessment, but just not a risk assessment. If you enter denotes, you will also get risk characterization ratios here for inhalation, for dermal, and the total. And you see here in the bold letters, that's where certain protective equipment has been applied to the scenario. And this is a red field, which indicates that the RCR is above 1. So there is a need for refinement of some sort. I need to cover denotes because that's something that is probably unique to the crop protection applications. The crop protection applications, they are seasonal. They are not all year long. There's only a couple of days, a narrow time window when you can apply your product because it's narrowed down to a certain growth stage of your culture. So what does it mean, seasonal? In the authorization of plant protection products, we are almost always using subchronic safety data from 90-day studies, and that is, of course, 3 months, and that's a summer or a spring, whatever. Amateur users, we think they are exposed on 1 or 2 occasions per year. I don't know, I have never used a plant protection product. I don't know how often you have been running around in your private garden and applying something, but I think or hope it won't be more than 1 or 2 occasions that you use it per year. So we're talking about an acute exposure. Also the bystanders, they are accidentally exposed, so that's also an acute exposure. If you have a complete set of denotes, just hypothetically, having a complete set of denotes means you have something for all durations and also for all subpopulations. So you get acute to chronic and also workers and general population. This may be the case, but I can see that many substances, for instance, don't have acute denotes just because the data is not sufficient to derive some. So they have to be surrogate denotes to be used with the model. As I said, denotes other than chronic will often not be available. One word on the dermal denotes. For the most part, they will be based on systemic effects, say hematology or something, then they will be expressed in milligrams per kilogram body weight and day. But if you have the luxury of having, say, a local lymph node assay for skin sensitization, you can go ahead and derive a local denote based on that effect. And then it's expressed in milligrams per centimeter square. So if you have that, it has been a long time, or it took me a while to find out that this could be a hypothetical case, and then you have no option, neither in TRA nor in OWB, to account for that. But so that I made a little revision of the model and incorporated that. So, but for the most part, as I try to make clear here, is the dermal denotes in many cases will be derived by a route-to-route extrapolation from oral studies. That's a common thing to do. And they will only reflect systemic effects. And so the denote in many cases, I say more than 90% of all chemicals, the dermal denote will be in mg per kg and day. But for the rare cases in which the dermal denotes are expressed in milligram per centimeter square, OWB offers the option of conducting a local exposure and risk assessment. The denotes is also something that I had to explain to people coming from crop protection. Has a totally different approach from what has been used in authorization of plant protection products, because the denotes, these are route-specific denotes rather than the overall systemic AOEL that aggregates all routes of exposure, and you do a systemic exposure assessment, and if the systemic exposure is not in excess of the AOEL, you're good and have a safe use. But here you have denotes for various routes, durations, and subpopulations, and also you do basically an external exposure assessment. This is a little spreadsheet that we use internally just to show you how complex a thing that can be, deriving a deno. You start with an NOEL, I don't know whether you can read that, of 100 from a 28-day oral study, just one example, and then you go through, apply various application factors. You would have to extrapolate for the worker from a subacute study, 28-day, to the subchronic scenario by applying a factor of 3. That's playing by the book of REACH, just applying the R8 default factors just on top of one another. You have a higher variability here for the general population. You have a 24-hour exposure for the general population, but only 8 hours for the worker. So that all kind of blends into the deno application. One fundamental difference to the plant protection thing, the crop protection people are used to applying dermal absorption values if they have always dermal absorption values for the active substance, and they will be applying these values for their systemic exposure assessment. That's where it's being factored in. But under REACH, the dermal absorption data, if you only in rare cases you will have some for coformulants, then this here, it's the deno derivation. That's the point where you apply the dermal absorption information if you have some, and not during the exposure assessment. So if you have dermal absorption information, that's the time to use it. Okay, how do we think that suppliers can use the model? Just what kind of parameters do you need to have, and what is really critical? Of course, you always need a molecular weight. That's just because you need to convert ppms into milligrams per cubic meters at some point. And that's just the need to do that. You need the molecular weight for that. The vapor pressure is needed for volatile substances. That should actually be 0.01, because that's what I said, that's when the vapor expression becomes significant. You need worker denotes, inhalation and dermal. They're always needed for risk assessment. The subchronic denal is preferred, but the chronic should be available. Same thing for the general population, because we have the bystanders, and these people are protected by the denal for the general population. Acute denal is preferred. The subacute should be available, because that would be a 28-day study of some sort, and if you don't apply any exposure duration modifier assessment factors to that NOEL from the subacute study, that should be a worst case surrogate for that. Application rate, there's a default of 1 kilogram per hectare, or if we're in the domain of seed treatment, that'd be a 50% content in the seed treatment formulation, which is pretty high. So we're talking about a solvent rather than just a minor emulgator or something. And this application rate is really a worst case assumption, and there should be no need to change that in the first tier. And also in the first tier, none of the options for protective equipment should be chosen. So what you need to do is just enter molecular weight and vapor pressure. That's data that everybody has, must have under REACH, except for solids, but then you don't need it. Enter the appropriate denotes. Leave all application rates on default, and no personal protective equipment and no respiratory protective equipment. Look at the overall risk characterization ratio, and if it's all green, you may hit a button that's called Create CSR, and I will come back to that later. If one or several scenarios are read, then you either add a first layer of PPE, preferably just gloves during mixing and loading, because that actually makes a major contribution to the protection. It actually has the single most protective effect, because that's when the concentration of the substance is maximum. It's in a concentrated plant protection product. Or you can also go ahead and determine a maximum allowable use rate by pushing a button that has a maximum rate on it. If it's all green, you can then go and create the CSR. And if you just do that, there's no input necessary from the downstream user for this basic assessment. You just leave everything on default, and you can decide either to reduce the application rate or add PPE. This decision, you can either offer both or choose either one, probably best in discussion with your downstream user at that point. And of course, the CSR is not the entire CSR. I'm sorry to tell you that. It's not, there's still some work you have to do. Even if, I think some people may be aware that there is a CSR tool coming out as a plugin for Euclid 5, and does some of the CSR, much like the CSR plugin that has been in place for 5.1, Euclid 5.1, there's now something for 5.2 called CSR. Even though this is not designed to work with CSR, what CSR will produce is also a Word document. So whatever you have in there, you can add the output from the tool into that CSR. So there's a high degree of flexibility there. So what the tool offers is a chapter 9, so all the exposure estimations with some narrative description of what the scenario looks, what it looks like, operational conditions, and so forth. And finally, somewhere will be the exposure estimation. And chapter 9 just contains the risk characterization for all the various scenarios.